Hello and welcome back to Gateway to Oddity. Today's video is going to be about the Satanic Panic and Dungeons and Dragons and a string of incidents that led to parents all over America and the world panicking about this innocent tabletop game. So Dungeons and Dragons is a game involving a group of players and they are led by someone in the game called a Dungeon Master, and it's the Dungeon Master's job to guide the group through an adventure. Dice are used to decide character strengths, traits, and weaknesses, and victories and losses in the game are decided using dice and also based on those characters' qualities and traits. The game is played mostly in the imagination, and they use pen and paper to mark their scores. It was created in 1974 by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. That was when they released Dungeons and Dragons after creating it in the early 70s. They based the game on their love of adventure and fantasy and war games. So how did this game spark a panic? In August 1979, a 16-year-old college sophomore named James Dallas Egbert III, he was known as Dallas, he disappeared from Michigan State University. The private investigator that was hired by the family, his name was William Deere. He went to Dallas's dorm room and he found Dungeons and Dragons paraphernalia around the room. He also found a cork board, and in the cork board there were like tacks, and they were arranged in what William Deere believed was the shape of a building, specifically a power plant called the Simon Power Plant. And students at the university admitted that they would sometimes explore the tunnels, like these big steam tunnels underneath the power plant. You may remember from my previous video about the McMartin preschool case that during the Satanic Panic, underground tunnels was like a huge thing. People were very concerned about underground tunnels. So it made a lot of sense for William Deere to trace Dallas Egbert's whereabouts to these steam tunnels. He believed that Dallas had had some kind of psychotic break and that he had gone to play Dungeons and Dragons in the steam tunnels under the power plant. He was, of course, incorrect. Not much is known about the circumstances under which Dallas was found, but he was found alive and well a few weeks after disappearing. William Deere went on to write a book called The Dungeon Master, The Disappearance of James Dallas Egbert III. The book focused largely on the investigation, and when this was released to the public mostly focused on the Dungeons and Dragons aspect of this book, rather than elements including the academic and parental pressure that would have been felt by someone like Dallas. He was 15 years old when he got a college scholarship and was shipped off to college. He was rumoured to use drugs and have psychiatric issues, and also James Dallas Egbert was a homosexual, and this was something he felt great shame about. He clearly had a lot of problems, and unfortunately in 1980, Dallas had his third suicide attempt, which was unfortunately successful, and he passed away. William Deere has stated in interviews that he still thinks Dungeons and Dragons had a huge part to play in Dallas's psychiatric problems, stating, quote, "Leaving the world of reality to the world of fantasy. It advocates murder, decapitation, and rape. This is not a healthy game," end quote. Now, of course, as I mentioned, this game was largely played by teenagers, and all of this controversy only fueled the popularity of the game. One of the writers of D&D stated, "We sold thousands and thousands and thousands more copies within 90 days of all of this happening. It's when we really took off." And this is true. We can see that the sales actually quadruple in the following year after the Dallas Egbert case. However, not everybody was happy about this, with televangelists describing the game as the most effective indoctrination to the occult in the history of man, claiming that it advocated for demonology, witchcraft, voodoo, murder, and rape. Gary Gygax himself and many members of his team were very shocked by the public's reaction and these kind of allegations. Gary Gygax himself was actually a very religious man. So now at this point, the media begins to link together a string of suicides and murders where either the victims or the killers were Dungeons and Dragons players. And I also want to show you a chick tract. If you don't know what chick tract is, they are fantastic. They are these like little moralistic cartoon comic things that are all about evangelism, and they're hilarious. So in this one we see this group of people playing D&D. They're very happy, and then one of them gets cursed by the black leaf, and the other girl is told by the dungeon master, well done, you have completed your training and you can now join our witchcraft coven. And the girl who was cursed by the black leaf, so upset that she can no longer play with her friends, and literally hangs herself. But don't worry about it, because all-American boy in varsity jacket with Superman hair has been fasting and praying for her soul, so everything's okay, I guess. Jack Chick was not the only person sensationalizing this story. At this time, we also see the book Mazes and Monsters by Rona Jaffe, and this was made into a made-for-TV movie starring Tom Hanks in his first ever leading role. And this is a dramatised version of the Egbert case, and I just want to give you a quick rundown of it because it's brilliant. So basically, they play Mazes and Monsters, which is like a fake version of Dungeons and Dragons. And after some absolutely ridiculous and convoluted events, they decide to play Eminem in these tunnels under their school, or caverns under their school, and they're not just playing with their characters and like writing down their scores like you do normally. They decide to pretend to be their characters and like play an imaginary game. And then Tom Hanks hallucinates that one of the monsters in the game is real and completely loses his mind. Then in a dream, someone comes to him and says that he needs to go to the two towers in order to join the Great Hall. He goes to New York City, gets attacked by some street toughs, does some more hallucinating, and then his ragtag group of buddies work out that the two towers means the World Trade Center, and Tom Hanks goes there and tries to chuck himself off of the observation deck in order to join the Great Hall. At this point, the dungeon master is like, you don't have enough points to join the Great Hall, Robbie. Stand down from your quest. And he does. But instead of like calling the police or like getting psychiatric help, they just play monsters and mazes together. It's so good. I highly recommend watching this movie. It's fantastic. So now that we've had a light-hearted interlude, let's get into some really depressing stuff. 1984. Darren Lee is convicted of the murder of a young woman named Mary Towie. In his initial trial, he wanted to enter Dungeons and Dragons as a defense for murder. He said that D&D taught him the effectiveness of mind games, and that is what he wanted to play with Mary. He had been preparing for a Friday the 13th party. She had come over to help with preparations. Darren and some friends tied her up, and they said they were playing mind games and horsing around, messing with her mind. At some point during this ordeal, Mary died from accidental strangulation, but this was still classified as murder in the first degree, even though the strangulation was accidental. They got him on a technicality, basically. So then he, of course, goes to jail, and he wrote this essay about Dungeons and Dragons, and it's actually it's interesting. I'm just going to read a few excerpts from it and kind of give a brief synopsis of it. So he explains how characters are created in the game by rolling dice. Then he describes a character as being a newborn character. He says they are now a true, real person in the player's mind. He explains again and again how real all of it is, including the violence in the game. He compares the effects to alcohol, drugs, and tobacco. He says it's a device of Satan to lure us away from God. Within the essay, he also quotes the Bible several times. He explains that that playing the game regularly means that the conscious mind, so the imagination, is filled with occultism and violence for the duration of the time you're playing. And then returning to reality is almost impossible for him. That's how he explains it in the essay. And he closes off the essay by saying, "Please, for your own safety and salvation and the safety of others, don't play the game anymore. If you don't play it now, don't even start. It is more dangerous than I can fully explain. Don't play with your physical life that way, and don't condemn your soul to hell by participating in the game." And what I found really interesting about this is obviously he's gone to jail or prison at the time he's written this essay, and that means he would have been through some kind of rehabilitation. And I think it's very interesting that this is kind of obviously the focus of his rehabilitation is the effects of Dungeons and Dragons and trying to heal from that. So the Mary Towie case was just one example of a young person committing a crime and having that be linked to Dungeons and Dragons. Another death that I think is very, very, very important in this narrative is Bink Pulling. His real name was Irving Pulling, and his mother's name was Pat, and she becomes a very important character in all of this. So Bink played Dungeons and Dragons at school, and he ended up committing suicide. He had really struggled fitting in for his whole school career. He had depression. This suicide was around the time of academic finals as well. But when his family went into his room after his death, they found a lot of Dungeons and Dragons paraphernalia. And it turns out that Bink had actually recently been cursed within the game. So Pat Pulling's, his mother, attempted to sue the principal of the school based on the fact that he was under your watch and you let him play this game. Now, you can't actually sue an individual person in America. You can't sue like a principal of a school while they are acting as like he was working for the government because he works at school, right? So you would have to sue either the school board or the school itself or something like that. You can't sue an individual. So the case was thrown out of court. Pat went on to found an organisation. She literally could not be stopped. She founded an organisation called BAD, Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons. She wrote several books. She encouraged parents to look out for behaviours such as grave robbing, stealing religious artefacts, drinking blood, signing suicide pacts, or exhibiting supremacist attitudes. She explained that adventurous, intelligent, creative kids with no history of drug use or behavioural problems are the ones who usually get sucked in. In another one of her books, she detailed how police officers should interact with and interrogate teenagers about their involvement with Dungeons and Dragons. She became a private investigator so that she could consult on cases relating to gaming. And on that basis, Michael A. Stackpole, the original writer of the Star Wars books, wrote the Pulling Report. He wrote this whole essay about Pat Pulling and her claims and called into question every single one of her claims, every single one of her qualifications, and absolutely tore her to pieces. And I highly recommend checking it out. It's how bizarre. And the absolute pièce de résistance of the Pat Pulling saga was her 60 Minutes segment. So both Pat Pulling and Gary Gygax and the head of PR for TSR and a few other characters that we're going to bring in along the way were interviewed for a 60-minute segment, and I managed to find it, and it's fantastic. So I'm going to kind of give you a run through of the order of events that happen. So we start off with a very stuffy looking adult man in a suit calling the game enormously complicated, which honestly, when adults say things like that about teenage culture, it normally means I'm not trying hard enough to connect with my teenage child. Like, think about it. When I was a kid, it was rap music. It was like all of the adults were like, oh, you can't even understand what they're saying. And it's like, well, every teenager can. And then now I guess it's like TikTok or whatever. I don't know. I'm not up with like the teen culture because I'm a stuffy adult. But do you know what I mean? It comes across in this very condescending and like silly kind of way. And then we cut to some footage of the nerdiest kids I've ever seen in my life. I'm so sorry. But if I were to say to you, like, draw someone who you think is stealing religious artifacts and drinking blood, you would draw the antithesis of these teenagers. They're incredible, terrible haircuts, massive glasses, and they're literally sitting around a table, rolling dice, saying things like, there is a green eyeball in the sky that has blotted out the sun. And that just really made me laugh, because this is what the adults are scared of. This is what they're like staying awake at night panicking about. Like, these kids they're just rolling dice. Anyway, the 60 Minutes program goes on to highlight some suicide cases and murder cases where either the victims or the perpetrators were players of Dungeons and Dragons. The head of PR for the company that made D&D, which was called TSR, he pointed out that 5 million teenagers, roughly, were playing Dungeons and Dragons in 1985. There was an epidemic of teen suicide, he said, and there have been 5,000 teenage suicides in 1985 alone. And you've managed to link about a dozen or so of those to Dungeons and Dragons in the last few years. So we can see that those statistics are pretty shocking. Like, I saw a comment on a video that was like, did you know almost every single person whose house is burnt down had a sink in their house? And it's like, you know, if so many teenagers are doing one thing and teenagers are in a high-risk group for suicide, there is going to be a crossover. The Venn diagram is not that complicated. But anyway, Gary Gygax, he says, this is a witch hunt. And then we cut to Pat. They very briefly explain the story of Bink's suicide. And Pat said Bink wrote on his suicide note that he had been summoned to kill himself because he was evil. It was obvious to my mind that he had assumed this character. She denies that Bink had any psychological problems at all, and that all of his issues stemmed from playing Dungeons and Dragons. We then cut to Dr. Thomas Radecki. So he's a psychiatrist, and he's one of the founding members of the National Coalition on Television Violence. So we know this is a very conservative type of person. He says that 28 deaths had been linked to D&D in the past 5 years. So that's between 1980 and 1985. In some, it was the decisive element, he says. In others, it was a major element. He goes on to cite cases like a child summoning a demon from the game in front of their parents before committing suicide. Make of that whatever you will. So Gary Gygax has this incredible quote about, I think it just about sums all of this up. He says, "This is make-believe. You cannot be murdered by make-believe. Nobody is bankrupted by losing at Monopoly. Pat Pullings hits back at this and says, it is different from Monopoly because there is no board. It's role-playing, which is used for behaviour modification. One of the D&D kids from the beginning with the glasses, he says, he explains this, and he says, bad characters are allowed to do bad things within the scope of the rules of the game. Good characters are defending the people from the bad characters. Either way, it's just your character doing it on a sheet of paper. When the game is over, the game doesn't tell you to go out and do bad things. Which, honestly, I feel like they could have just interviewed these 6 D&D players and they could have explained this better than anyone else. Then there is a little interview with Bink's little sister, and she says tearfully that Bink had threatened to kill her one time, and this was because she had threatened to reveal to their parents that he had been playing D&D. And I think this is very interesting, not just because literally everyone who has a sibling has threatened to kill their sibling. Every single one of us. Not just that, every sibling has done that. But he was terrified of his parents finding out that he was playing this game. Which means this was obviously something that was very, very important to him. This was one of the only ways that he knew how to socialise. He had no real friends until he found his D&D group. And he was going through a lot, depending on which sources you look at, he had some serious psychological problems. But he knew if his parents were to find out about him playing this game that was so important to him, that they would take that away. And I think that really highlights what kind of family we're talking about here. Gary Gygax even says, there is no link except for in the minds of people who are looking for an explanation rather than their own failures as parents, which I think is a very, very pertinent quote. Dr. Thomas Radecki calls for an independent consumer product review to investigate the link to these deaths. So what that basically means is if there is a product on the market that is causing lots of harm or lots of death to consumers, they have to do this kind of review of the product, and that will determine whether it's pulled off the shelves. So he's saying that this is so dangerous, this is causing such psychological harm to teenagers that it's causing enough deaths and harm for it to be literally pulled off of the shelves by an independent body of marketing people. So yeah, that's kind of most of what happens in this 60 minutes interview. But then it goes really, really weird. So they explain that Dr. Thomas Radecki, who had founded the National Coalition on Television Violence, he had actually been stripped of his license to practice medicine due to immoral conduct of engaging in an unprofessional nature with a patient. Then the episode becomes this completely different thing about Thomas Radecki and his immoral practices relating to surrogacy. Basically, he'd been calling college freshmen who were 17, 18-year-old girls and trying to recruit them to become surrogate mothers. And then, obviously, I had to find out what happened to him after this. So I looked him up. Turns out he's in prison because he was convicted on charges of prescribing opiates illegally. So that's So that was the 60 minutes interview. I thought that there were some very interesting aspects to it. It was very interesting to hear Gary Gygax kind of address these rumours and this speculation. And he is equally, I explained, these D&D kids that are just having a great time with their friends, rolling dice and writing stuff on bits of paper. Gary Gygax is one of those people. At heart, you can just feel this real nerd energy coming from him. And he clearly is just someone who wants to share his passions with the world, and suddenly people are calling him a Satanist, a cultist who's trying to indoctrinate children into witchcraft, and it's very confusing for him, but he takes it very well. I wanted to bring in as well just a couple of more things that I couldn't fit anywhere else in this video that's very long already. In 2006, someone did a Freedom of Information request on Dungeons and Dragons to the FBI. And basically, if the FBI have a file on something and you ask them about it, they have to tell you. So turns out in 1983, the town where D&D was created was also somewhere that had lots of cocaine trafficking. And the FBI were watching TSR, like the company that makes D&D, because they believed that they were somehow involved in cocaine trafficking. And then in 1995, a Dungeons and Dragons group were connected to the Unabomber. They even referred to the group as being known members of the Dungeons and Dragons, which I think is pretty badass. I think that's a really cool way to be referred to. They showed this group like images of the Unabomber, like, you know, sketches and images of Unabomber related things. And the group members apparently became very paranoid, which, you know, if the FBI has showed up at my house and accused me of being involved in the Unabomber, like, I'd probably be a little bit paranoid too. But then the FBI in their report said they were quite sure that members of the group fantasized about one of the members being connected to the bombing. Don't know where they got that information from. So, what do we learn from all this? I honestly believe that the panic around Dungeons and Dragons had almost nothing to do with the children's immortal souls. I think that the panic had almost everything to do with that feeling of losing your teenager to a world that you don't understand. There is something really powerful about that for parents. You know, you have your babies and you almost like control every aspect of their life because they're too little to have the autonomy to do that for themselves. And then as they get older, they get into different interests and they have different friends that you don't necessarily know, and they know more about the world, the modern world, than you do. And it's very natural for that to be a frightening time. And when everyone around you is telling you that you should be frightened, I think that that's how we get here to a place where we have organisations like BADD bothered about Dungeons and Dragons. Teen suicide is a very real issue, and it's something that needs to be addressed as within our society, but also within our households. Like, can you honestly say, like, when you were a teenager, that your parents knew every single time you cried yourself to sleep? Probably not. I think that it's easy to find something to blame for something you have immense guilt about. And, you know, murders, people will attach anything to their psychological problem and call it a motivation for murder. It happens all the time. Like, we've seen this with murders. We've seen this with cartoon shows. We've seen this with, oh my God, the book The Catcher in the Rye. I am going to do a video about that book one day, and I'm going to expose it for being a terrible work of literature that people think is a classic. And it really annoys me. Anyway, that's a different video for a different day. I want to leave you with a quote from Gary Gygax. He said, "There is a call to adventure. It's something in the inner psyche of humanity." And I think that just about sums up why people play this game, and also why people fear this game. So I'm going to leave you with that. Please tell me if you like this video, give this video a thumbs up, continue the conversation down in the comments, and please subscribe and turn on all notifications, and I will see you in the next one.